What if the God you believe in never existed? Not because he was proven false, but because he was never needed in the first place. What if the idea of God was never about truth, but about control, about comfort, order, a cosmic parent to explain the chaos? For thousands of years, God was the answer to everything. Why are we here? God. Why is there suffering? God. Why should we be moral? God. But slowly, that answer stopped working. Science began to explain. What used to be mystery, psychology began to expose. What used to be called sin and human suffering remained untouched by prayer. And then Nietzsche said it out loud. God is dead, and we have killed him. He didn't mean a literal death. He meant that the idea of God as the foundation of truth, of morality, of existence itself, was collapsing, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, culturally, from the inside, because people no longer believed. Not really. Not in the way that anchored civilizations. They still went to church, still said the words. But deep down, they no longer felt the presence. And that silence, that absence, that unbearable lack of certainty is what Nietzsche warned about. Because when God dies, truth dies with him. Objective morality, gone. Universal purpose, gone. The comfort of knowing someone is watching, gone. You are left alone, free, and terrified. So philosophy asked, can we prove God? Some said yes. The cosmological argument said, everything has a cause. The universe exists, so something must have caused it. That first cause? God. But why must that cause be conscious? Personal? Loving? Why not simply dash, a force, a law, an explosion? The teleological argument said, look at the order of the universe, the beauty, the complexity. It must have been designed, but evolution, probability, and chaos can all produce structure without intention. Order does not imply a mind. The ontological argument claimed God must exist because we can imagine a perfect being, but imagination is not evidence. You can conceive of a perfect island, a perfect life. That doesn't make them real. Even great minds like Aquinas offered elegant proofs, but each one required what philosophers call smuggling the conclusion into the premise, a hidden assumption that God must exist. But that's not proof, that's desire. David Hume warned us centuries ago, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And the evidence for God's existence was never universal. It was cultural, emotional, subjective. So the question shifted. Maybe the issue isn't proof, maybe it's need. Why do we want God to exist? Because without him, we are exposed. With God, suffering has meaning. Without him, pain is just pain. With God, death is a doorway. Without him, it's the end. With God, there's right and wrong. Without him, there's only choice. And that, Nietzsche said, is what terrifies people most. Not that God doesn't exist, but that they must now become the authors of meaning. No more commandments, no more divine plan, no more sacred scripts to hide behind, only the abyss and the freedom to build something within it. But most can't, so they turn back to religion, to dogma, to anything. That feels certain, because the truth is unbearable. That maybe there is no truth, only us, our questions, and the silence they echo into. Not all philosophers rejected God, but the most honest ones doubted him. They doubted his nature, his goodness, even is necessity. Not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. Because if you follow logic long enough, you find yourself standing at the gates of uncertainty. And for many thinkers, those gates led away from God. David Hume didn't rage against faith. He dismantled it. Calmly, rationally, relentlessly. He asked simple questions that had no simple answers. Can miracles be trusted? If all our knowledge comes from experience, and we've only ever experienced a world bound by natural laws, then what right do we have to believe in something that breaks them? If someone tells you they saw the dead rise, do you believe them? Or do you believe that human error is more likely than divine intervention? Hume said, "A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as such, it must be more improbable than the possibility that the testimony is false." In other words, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and religion, he believed, never delivered. But Hume went further. He questioned the very foundation of causality. We assume that because one thing follows another, it must have been caused by it. But what we really observe is just sequence dash, not necessity. So the argument that everything must have a cause might not even be valid, and if it's not, then the whole cosmological argument for God collapses. Immanuel Kant, on the other hand, was more careful. He didn't reject God, but he admitted, I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Kant believed that human reason had limits, that we could never truly prove God's existence. But we could still believe in Him for moral reasons. He argued that ethics depends on the assumption of free will, of justice, and of a final judge. In other words, God may not be provable, but He is necessary for our moral structure to work. But is that belief or fear? Do we believe in God because He's true, or because without Him we don't know what's right? Kant left the door open, but he never walked through it. Fyodor Dostoevsky stepped in. He was not a philosopher in the classical sense, but he saw deeper than most. In The Brothers Karamazov, he wrote, "If God is dead, then everything is permitted." It was not a celebration, it was a warning. Dostoevsky feared that without God, humans would descend into moral chaos, that the soul, left alone, would rot. He explored characters who tried to live without faith and ended in despair, madness, or worse. He didn't offer a logical argument for God. He offered a psychological one, a vision of what happens when man becomes his own God, and the picture was terrifying. But Dostoevsky's greatest insight was not about God, but about what happens without Him. He saw how people don't stop worshiping. When they stop believing, they just change the altar to ideology, to power, to the state, to other people, because the human soul craves something above itself. And when God is gone, something else fills the void. So what do we take from this? Hume showed us that religion's logic can't be trusted. Kant showed us that even reason needs faith to stay sane. Dostoevsky showed us that the absence of God doesn't lead to liberation. It leads to temptation. And all of them, in their own way, feared the same thing. Not that God might exist, but that He might not. And if He doesn't, then it's all on us. Every choice, every value, every meaning must be made, not received. That's the burden of freedom. And most people would rather be ruled than carry it. Let's assume, just for a moment, that God exists, not the God of myth, not the God of comfort, but the true philosophical God, perfect, infinite, eternal, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good. But here's the question no one wants to ask. Is that even possible? Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries because these three attributes, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, don't always fit together. In fact, they often contradict. Let's break them down. First, omnipotence. All-powerful. If God is all-powerful, He can do anything, right? Then here's the classic problem. Can God create a rock so heavy that He cannot lift it? If yes, He's not all-powerful because He can't lift it. If no, He's not all-powerful because He can't create it. Either way, omnipotence collapses. But maybe that's a trick question. Maybe omnipotence only includes what is logically possible. Okay, fair. But what about this? If God is all-powerful, can He prevent evil? If He can, why doesn't He? If He can't, is He still God? Dusra, omnibenevolence. All good. God is truly good. Why is the world so full of pain, famine, abuse, genocide, cancer, loneliness, mental illness? If He's good and He sees this, why doesn't He stop it? Theists often reply, He gave us free will. Fair. So some evil is our fault. But what about earthquakes, diseases, dead children, animals eaten alive? No human free will caused those. And if God allows them, what kind of goodness is that? Some say God works in mysterious ways. But that's not an answer. That's an escape hatch. And philosophy demands better. Mundram, omniscience. All-knowing. If God knows everything, He knows the future, He knows your choices before you make them, then how are you free? If your path is already known, can you ever truly choose it? And if you can't choose, are you responsible for anything? If God created you, knowing you would suffer, fail, sin, and burn, what does that say about Him? Is that love or cruelty dressed as destiny? This is the problem of divine attributes. Individually, they sound powerful. Together, they tear each other apart. You can have an all-powerful God, or an all-good God, or an all-knowing God. But the more of these traits you stack, the harder it is to hold the image together. Even Aristotle, who believed in a prime mover, didn't give him emotions. His God didn't care, didn't love, didn't judge. He simply was. Pure thought thinking itself. A perfect being, with no connection to humans at all. More a principle than a person. So maybe that's the problem. We want God to be human, to feel what we feel, to care like we care, to love like a father, to punish like a judge, to listen like a friend. But if He exists, He may be nothing like that. He may be beyond emotion, beyond logic, beyond good and evil. Not comforting, not warm, but terrifying in His indifference. And if that's true, do we still want Him? Or do we only want the version of God that fits our needs? The God who cares, who protects, who saves, not the God who watches, who permits, who does nothing. So we ask again, if God exists, what is He? A mind, a force, a father, a mirror, or just the word we give to what we don't understand? Maybe God doesn't exist in the sky. Maybe He exists in your mind, not as a lie, but as a structure, a pattern, a projection, your psyche built to survive the chaos of being alive. Because even if God is not real, He might still be necessary. Sigmund Freud didn't believe in God. He believed in the need for him. To Freud, religion was not revelation. It was compensation, a psychological response to the terror of reality. We are born helpless, small, dependent, and the first figure we worship is the Father. Strong, powerful, protective, punishing. The one who makes the rules and keeps the world safe. So when we grow up, Freud said, we project that image onto the sky. Religion is the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. Freud, in other words, belief in God, is the mind's way of not falling apart, a fantasy, but a useful one. When we feel powerless, we pray. When we feel lost, we look up. When we suffer, we want it to mean something. And the idea of God gives us all of that, not because it's true, but because it keeps us from breaking. But not all psychologists were so cynical. Carl Jung believed that the image of God was not a mistake, but a message, an archetype, deep in the collective unconscious, not something we were taught, but something we carry. Jung saw God not as a man in the clouds, but as a symbol of the self, the totality of who we are and who we could become. The divine image represents wholeness, balance, the unification of opposites. When we seek God, we are really seeking our own center, the part of us that is beyond ego, beyond fear, beyond time. And in that sense, God is real, not out there, but in here. So when ancient people imagined gods, Jung said, they weren't inventing lies. They were revealing truths about the human soul, truths we've forgotten. In our obsession with facts, that's the psychological God, a reflection of our deepest yearnings, our highest ideals, our need for meaning in a world that offers none. So even if God doesn't exist, in any metaphysical sense, he may still be the most powerful idea we've ever had, because without him, the mind drifts, the moral compass spins, the ego inflates, the shadows grow, and we're left with nothing but ourselves. And sometimes that's not enough. That's why belief persists, not because the arguments are strong, but because the alternatives feel unbearable. We don't need God to be true. We need him to make life livable. And that raises the question, is that faith or is that fear? Do we believe because it brings us closer to truth, or because we can't handle the void? Jung believed we had to confront the void, integrate it, own it. Only then could we stop projecting God onto the sky and begin to embody what he represents. Not perfection, not control, but unity, wisdom, wholeness. In that sense, the death of God is not a loss, it's a beginning, the chance to step into the sacred space he once occupied and become what we used to worship, not in arrogance, but in evolution. So, does God exist? The philosophers argued, the scientists doubted, the psychologists reframed, and still, the question remains. But maybe the question is not, does God exist? Maybe it's, do you need him to? Because even if no divine being watches over you, even if no plan was written, even if the sky is empty, you are still here, still breathing, still choosing, still searching. And that means you are the only one left to decide what is sacred. Maybe God was never about proof. Maybe he was the name we gave to the parts of ourselves we couldn't yet understand, to conscience, to courage, to the ability to endure pain with grace. Nietzsche warned that when God dies, so does truth, so does meaning, so does morality. But he also said this: he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. And if there is no why given, then it's yours to build. Maybe the real challenge is not believing in God, but living in a world where you might be the closest thing to Him, not in power, not in perfection, but in responsibility. Because now it's up to you. You are the one who must choose good when no one is watching. You are the one who must create meaning where there is none. You are the one who must walk forward without the promise of reward or forgiveness. And if that isn't divine, what is? Share this video with someone who's been wrestling with doubt, but ready to ask the questions most are too afraid to face. Comment below, "I confront the silence of God." Let the silence be where your truth begins. The journey continues in the next video. Not because it must, but because you choose it. Because answers are rare, but clarity, that's earned.